Hi, I'm Kirk McDermid from the Philosophy Department here at Montclair State, and I'm here today to try and give you some useful and feasible tips for incorporating more critical thinking in your classes. The first thing, the overarching principle that I want to share up front at the top of the video is to try and give your students space to metacognize. And what I mean by that is to think about their thinking, to think about their classmates' thinking, as it's happening in the moment. Often students get some skills at particular aspects of thinking or analyzing arguments, but they are not very good without having some outside person come in and help guide them towards thinking better in a consistent fashion. And so building space for students to gain a habit of reflecting on their own thinking as it's happening, and the thinking of classmates or the other people that they're discussing with is very important. The next tricky part about instructing critical thinking effectively in a classroom is that you have to find real life, real world engaging topics for students to practice critical thinking on. If you give them excessively textbook or artificial examples that they don't connect with, then they can overperform because they don't really have a stake in the thinking that they are criticizing or analyzing. On the flip side, if you give them interesting, engaging topics, then all of their energy gets invested in defending a viewpoint or criticizing a viewpoint that they disagree with. And what happens then is that they fall back on habits and techniques that they are already familiar with and comfortable with. There are some in-classroom techniques that you can use to try and give them some of that distance, to try and provide support for them to stand back and watch both themselves and other people think through the problem. One of those is a kind of fishbowl technique where only part of the class is involved or permitted to join the discussion, and the rest of the class is explicitly told to stay quiet and observe their classmates discussing or thinking aloud about the subject so that they have that cognitive room to get a step back from the discussion and focus on the actual thinking that's going on and being able to evaluate it while it's happening. Of course, critical thinking doesn't just happen in discussions in the classroom. It happens all over the place, and one of the places we really like to see it happen is in writing. One of the key deficits I see in my students is that they are over-focused in their writing, especially their argumentative writing, in persuading the reader. And so they are not very aware of the need to have objections, to entertain and respond to objections in their paper. And I find that a critical part of teaching reasoning and critical thinking, both as a practical matter, but also in terms of assessment. It's hard to be confident that a student really understands critically and profoundly the topic that they're writing on if they only show you one side of an argument. And students find this really difficult at first. Just asking students, I would like you to have an objection, requiring that they deal with an objection, is going to likely get you, for most students, a half of a sentence. I'll get students who will present an objection, but are so preoccupied and habituated with defending the thesis that is the main task of their paper that they can't even finish that sentence that presents the objection without tacking on a but clause at the end of it to immediately refute it, and that's not what I'm looking for. So oftentimes you have to require them to devote a significant proportion of the paper to reasonable, persuasive, plausible objections from different viewpoints, and get them to explain and describe that objection fully before they respond to it. The last thing that would be a useful thing for you to think about incorporating in your classrooms is moving away from using argumentation and critical thinking in writing and put it in a different modality. And that modality is a visual representation of argument. or reasoning that the students are engaged in or are trying to develop. And what I mean by that is using argument mapping. Now, I'm fairly sure that most people watching this video are familiar with mind maps or concept maps, where you give students a nice blank sheet of paper to write out ideas and connect them using all sorts of different relationships to try and organize their thoughts. And if you can get students to articulate their thinking, their argument, their reasoning about a topic visually using a map, it can become evident both to them and everybody else whether they are suffering a little bit from muddled thinking. It also makes it much more visually evident which parts of their argument are more detailed or well-researched or well thought out. And it also makes explicit what parts of their argument are weakest. If they have a map, they can look at the particular claim or set of claims that someone is criticizing, and more possibilities for response generally open up when they can see it in that kind of context. The other last benefit of those sorts of approaches to teaching critical thinking are that it can help overcome language barriers. If students aren't comfortable with their writing because their writing isn't the strongest, giving them the ability to express their understanding and an argument for a particular thesis using an argument map can often just sidestep those issues entirely. So I hope that the tips that I gave you today and the ways of thinking about how to deliver and promote critical thinking in the classroom have been helpful, and that you will try some out in the near future.